It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Quiet streets lined with well-kept houses, trimmed hedges, and the occasional porch light flickering in the evening breeze. Kind of place where people waved to their neighbors, where kids rode their bikes in the summer, and where the worst thing that ever happened was someone forgetting to take their trash cans in on time. But on that night, something shattered the illusion of safety. The house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, a two-story home with large bay windows and a perfectly manicured lawn. Inside, the lights were still on, though the silence felt unnatural. A glass of red wine sat untouched on the coffee table. A phone lay face down on the kitchen counter, and somewhere in the distance, a clock ticked steadily, oblivious to the chaos about to unfold. He parked in the driveway, the headlights casting long shadows against the house. Something felt off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The front door was locked, just as he had expected, but when he stepped inside, the air was thick, stifling almost. "Claire?" His voice echoed slightly in the quiet house. No answer. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 10:42 p.m. She was usually in bed by now. Maybe she had fallen asleep early. Then he noticed it. The faint glow coming from under the bedroom door upstairs. His breath caught in his throat. Something was wrong. With each step up the staircase, a strange pressure built in his chest, a creeping sensation that made his hands clammy and his heart pound harder. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for him to see the edge of their bed, and then he saw it. His breath hitched, the world narrowing to a single horrifying moment that he would never be able to erase from his mind. Claire wasn't alone, but it wasn't just betrayal that sent the blood draining from his face. It wasn't just another man in his bed. It was the look in her eyes and the glint of something sharp in her hand. Everything after that became a blur, a haze of shock, adrenaline, and something much darker bubbling just beneath the surface. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was something far worse. Ethan's breath was shallow, his fingers trembling as he clutched the door frame. His mind struggled to process the scene before him. Claire, his wife of 7 years, wasn't just with another man. She was gripping a knife, her knuckles white with tension. The stranger in their bed was frozen in place, eyes wide with fear. Claire turned her head slowly, her expression unreadable. The softness he once knew in her features was gone, replaced by something else, something hollow, something cold. "Ethan," she murmured, her voice eerily calm. The air in the room was suffocating. Every muscle in Ethan's body screamed at him to move, to do something, to say something. But he couldn't. The stranger, mid-30s, dark hair, fit, lifted his hands in surrender, as if that would help. "Look, man, this isn't what it looks like." The absurdity of those words made something snap inside Ethan. He let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Isn't it?" His voice was low, rough. "Then tell me, what the hell is it?" Claire didn't move, didn't flinch. Her grip on the knife stayed firm. Then she did something Ethan didn't expect. She smiled. It wasn't a smirk, wasn't taunting. It was something worse. It was knowing. And just like that, the moment shattered. Tension had been building for months, maybe years. Ethan had seen the signs, but he had ignored them. The late nights, the distant stares, the way Claire barely touched him anymore. He had chalked it up to routine, to the exhaustion of marriage, to the unspoken weight of their lives pressing down on them. But maybe it had never been exhaustion. Maybe it had been something far more sinister. Weeks before this night, things had already been unraveling. Claire had started spending more time out of the house, vague about where she was going. She always had an excuse: dinners with friends, errands, last-minute appointments. Ethan wanted to trust her. He wanted to believe that this was just a phase, that she was just restless, that things between them could still be fixed. But the distance between them had grown into something unbridgeable. And then there was the money. Claire had access to their joint accounts, but Ethan had noticed odd withdrawals, large sums disappearing without explanation. Whenever he asked, she brushed him off. "Just bills," she'd say. "Nothing to worry about." But he did worry, because Claire wasn't the type to be careless with money. And there were other things. Subtle, small things. The way she locked her phone when he walked into the room. The hushed phone calls that ended the second he was within earshot. The way she avoided his touch, as if the very idea of being close to him made her uncomfortable. Ethan had convinced himself he was overthinking it. until he saw the man. It had been a week ago. He had left work early, exhausted from a long meeting, hoping to surprise Claire with dinner. He never made it inside. Through the front window, he saw her, standing too close to a man he didn't recognize, laughing, whispering something in his ear. The intimacy between them was unmistakable. Ethan had stayed in the car, gripping the steering wheel so hard his fingers ached. Something inside him twisted. Jealousy? Maybe. But it wasn't just that. It was betrayal. Because it wasn't just another man. It was the look on Claire's face. A look she hadn't given Ethan in years. That night, he hadn't confronted her. Instead, he had watched her carefully, studied her, trying to understand what had gone wrong between them. And then he found something worse. A second phone, hidden in her closet, tucked inside a shoebox. He stared at it for a long time before finally turning it on. The messages were there, dozens of them, some meaningless, some explicit, some that made his blood run cold. And one that stood out more than the rest. He's getting suspicious. We need to be careful. Ethan had stared at those words for what felt like hours. Careful. Careful of what? Was it just an affair, or was it something else? The walls were closing in. The next few days, Ethan played the role of the clueless husband. He didn't tell Claire what he knew. He didn't mention the texts. He didn't let on that he had started watching her more closely, because he needed to understand. Claire had always been secretive about her past. There were things she refused to talk about, things she brushed off when Ethan asked. She had grown up in a broken home, raised by a father who drank too much and a mother who barely spoke. She had learned young that love was conditional, that trust was something you gave sparingly. But Ethan had believed she was different. Now he wasn't so sure. Because as the days passed, it became clear that this wasn't just infidelity. It was something bigger. Claire wasn't just pulling away from him. She was planning something. And Ethan had a sickening feeling that whatever it wasn't just about leaving him. It was about destroying him. Then came the breaking point. The night before Ethan found her with the knife in her hand, there had been another strange withdrawal from their bank account. This time it was thousands. And then Claire had asked him something that sent alarms ringing in his head. "Are you still keeping your safe in the study?" She had asked it casually, pouring herself a drink at the kitchen counter. But there was something in her tone, something too rehearsed. Ethan had forced a smile. "Yeah, why?" She shrugged. "Just wondering." That was the moment Ethan knew. Claire wasn't just cheating. She was setting him up. For what? He wasn't sure. But he had seen enough crime cases in the news to know when someone was planning something they shouldn't be. So, he had left work early the next day, and he had walked into the house at exactly the wrong time. Or maybe exactly the right time. Because now, as he stood in the doorway, watching Claire grip that knife with steady hands, he realized something chilling. This wasn't about an affair. This wasn't about love. This was about survival, and he wasn't sure if he was the one fighting to survive, or if she was. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to catch up with the moment unraveling before him. The dim glow from the bedside lamp cast long shadows across the room, stretching and distorting reality into something unreal, something nightmarish. Claire's grip on the knife was unwavering, her eyes locked onto his, unreadable, detached. The man beside her, the stranger, was shirtless, his face pale and slick with sweat. His chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked breaths. For a moment, none of them moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the ceiling fan, the rhythmic tick of the clock on the wall. Then Ethan took a step forward. Claire shifted, her body tensing. The knife in her hand glinted under the soft light. "Put it down," Ethan said, his voice strained, quiet. Claire didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, almost as if she were considering his request, measuring him. Then, slowly, she turned to the man beside her. Ethan saw it a second before it happened, the shift in her stance, the tightening of her fingers around the hilt, the sharp inhale that came before the strike. She lunged. The blade sank into the man's side with a sickening wet sound. A gasp tore from his throat, his body jerking violently as pain overtook him. His hands scrambled for Claire's wrist, but she twisted the knife deeper, her face calm. Ethan's mind shattered into fragments of disbelief and horror. He moved without thinking, rushing forward, grabbing Claire's arm, pulling her back. But she fought against him with a strength he didn't expect, her breath ragged, her body thrashing. The man stumbled from the bed, his hand pressed against the wound in his side. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining the sheets, dripping onto the hardwood floor. He tried to speak, but the only thing that came out was a gurgled, choked sound. "Claire!" Ethan shouted, tightening his grip. "What the hell are you doing?" Claire twisted in his grasp, turning to face him fully. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes were wild, almost feverish. "You weren't supposed to be here," she whispered. Ethan's stomach dropped. She had planned this. This wasn't some impulsive act of rage. This wasn't just about infidelity. This was something else entirely. The man let out a weak cough, sinking to his knees, his strength failing him. Blood pooled around him, dark and thick. Ethan's breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the sharp, irreversible reality of what had just happened. He had two choices: call for help, or become part of it. Claire seemed to sense his hesitation, her lips curling into something almost like relief. "You can't save him," she said softly. "It's too late." Ethan looked down at the man, his body slumped, his face drained of color. The pool of blood was growing, but he was still alive. For now. Ethan's hands shook. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. "Why?" His voice was barely a whisper. Claire exhaled, slow and measured, as if she had all the time in the world. "Because he wasn't just an affair, Ethan. He was a loose end." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't crying. She was calm, cold. She stepped closer, pressing a blood-stained hand against his chest. "You need to make a choice," she murmured. Ethan's breath hitched. She was asking him to help her, to finish it, to be part of this. For a split second, his mind raced through the possibilities, the consequences, the weight of what it meant. And then the man on the floor coughed, weak but still fighting, a flicker of life, a reminder. Ethan moved before he could think. With a sharp, desperate motion, he shoved Claire back, sending her stumbling. She hit the nightstand, the lamp crashing to the floor with a burst of shattered glass. He turned toward the man, dropping to his knees. "Stay with me," he urged, pressing his hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. His fingers were slick with blood. "I'm calling for help." Claire let out a slow breath behind him. Then, in an instant, he heard the shift of her feet against the floor. The knife was coming again. Ethan barely had time to react. He grabbed the first thing within reach, the heavy bedside clock, and swung. The impact sent Claire staggering, the knife slipping from her fingers. She crumpled to the ground, dazed. Ethan wasted no time. He grabbed the knife, throwing it across the room before scrambling for his phone. 911. His hands were shaking so badly it took him 2 tries to hit the call button. The operator's voice crackled through the line. "My wife?" He choked out, breathless. She tried to... There's a man. He's been stabbed. Send help. Now!" Claire groaned, pushing herself up onto her elbows, her head lolling slightly. Ethan met her gaze. For the first time that night, something changed in her expression. It wasn't anger. It wasn't regret. It was something close to amusement. She smiled, and Ethan realized something. This wasn't the end. Not for her, and definitely not for him. The sirens cut through the night like a blade, their wailing growing louder with each passing second. Ethan sat on the floor, his back pressed against the wall, his hands still stained with blood, some of it his, most of it the stranger's. The man, whose name Ethan later learned was Daniel Carter, had barely been breathing when the paramedics arrived. They had worked frantically, stabilizing him just enough to rush him to the hospital. Claire, on the other hand, had remained eerily composed. She sat quietly in the middle of the wreckage, broken glass, blood-soaked sheets, the overturned lamp, watching as the officers swarmed the room. When they pulled her to her feet, she didn't resist. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply turned her head toward Ethan, locking eyes with him for one long, unbearable second before offering the smallest, almost imperceptible smile, as if she had won. They took her away in handcuffs, but Ethan knew it wasn't over. Not really. The investigation. The next few days were a blur of questioning, paperwork, and sleepless nights. Ethan had given his statement repeatedly, how he had come home late, how he had walked in on the attack, how he had wrestled the knife away. But it didn't take long for the police to uncover the full picture. Claire hadn't just been cheating. She had been planning something far worse. Bank statements showed the missing money, transferred in small amounts to an untraceable account. Her second phone revealed months of messages between her and Daniel, conversations that started as an affair but evolved into something more sinister. Daniel, as it turned out, wasn't just her lover. He had been her accomplice. The plan, Ethan would later learn, had been in motion for months. Claire had convinced Daniel that Ethan was abusive, that she was trapped in a marriage with a dangerous man. She played the role of the victim so convincingly that Daniel believed her, believed that the only way they could be together was if Ethan was gone. Permanently. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Maybe Daniel started having doubts. Maybe he wasn't willing to go through with it. Maybe he had tried to back out. And Claire couldn't risk that, so she turned on him instead. The trial and public reaction. The case was sensational. A suburban wife, an affair turned violent, a near-fatal stabbing, all the makings of a headline that the media ate up. The press painted Claire as a femme fatale, a cold and calculated woman who had manipulated her lover into a murder plot, only to betray him when he hesitated. Every detail was scrutinized, every old photo of their once happy marriage now serving as eerie reminders of the illusion Ethan had been living under. The trial lasted months, but the verdict felt inevitable. Claire was convicted of attempted murder and conspiracy, sentenced to 25 years in prison. Daniel survived, though barely. He testified against Claire, his face still pale from the trauma of that night. In the end, his punishment was different. Guilt. He had been a willing participant in something terrible, even if he hadn't been the one holding the knife when it all unraveled. Ethan, though legally exonerated, wasn't free from the consequences. The aftermath. For weeks after the trial, Ethan couldn't step outside without feeling eyes on him. Some looked at him with pity, others with suspicion. People whispered about him in grocery store aisles, speculated about how he hadn't seen it coming, about how his own wife had planned his murder while he remained oblivious. His house, once a place of comfort, felt like a crime scene he couldn't escape. The blood had been cleaned, the broken glass swept away, but the memories lingered. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the porch light reminded him of the night he walked in and saw the unthinkable. Sleep became a battle. Some nights, he woke up drenched in sweat, convinced he could hear Claire's voice in the darkness. Other nights, he dreamt of her smile, the one she had given him as the officers took her away. The worst part wasn't the nightmares, it was the doubt. He replayed everything in his head, searching for the moment when he should have seen it coming. The way she had distanced herself, the way she had tested his reactions, slowly pushing boundaries, the way she had looked at him in the weeks leading up to it, as if she was already saying goodbye. Had she ever loved him? Or had it all been a performance, a carefully constructed act leading to an inevitable end? He would never know. Moving forward. Ethan sold the house. He left the neighborhood, the city, moved somewhere quieter, where no one knew his name. He stopped following the news about Claire, stopped checking for updates about her appeals. But sometimes, late at night, he still thought about her, about the way she had fooled him, about the way she had almost gotten away with it, and about how, in the end, she had been right about one thing. He wasn't supposed to be there that night, and if he hadn't been, he wouldn't be alive to tell the story. Ethan sat on the balcony of his new apartment, staring at the city skyline as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and deep purple, colors that once felt warm and familiar but now seemed distant, almost artificial. It had been over a year since that night, since the moment his life had unraveled with the glint of a knife and a single whispered sentence. "You weren't supposed to be here." The words still haunted him, echoing in the back of his mind when everything else went quiet. He had replayed that moment countless times, trying to make sense of it, trying to pinpoint the exact second when the woman he had loved turned into a stranger. But the truth was, she had always been a stranger. He just hadn't seen it. Final outcomes: justice or just another story? Claire's conviction brought a sense of closure to many, especially to the prosecutors who paraded the case as a triumph of justice. The media moved on quickly, as they always did, shifting their attention to the next scandal, the next crime, the next woman who betrayed the man who trusted her. But for Ethan, there was no closure. There were only questions without answers. Did Claire feel regret? Did she ever love him, even in some twisted way? Or was he just another piece in the game she had been playing? Daniel Carter, the man she had stabbed, recovered physically, but his life would never be the same. He had been a willing participant in a crime that nearly got him killed, manipulated into believing Claire's lies, into thinking she was a victim when she had been the predator all along. He testified against her, his voice shaking on the stand, his face drawn with guilt and exhaustion. But in the end, was he really a victim? Or had he been a fool who had let his obsession blind him to the truth? Claire, despite her sentence, remained an enigma. Reports from prison suggested she adapted quickly, charming some, unnerving others. She was neither broken nor remorseful. She remained a woman who played by her own rules, one step ahead of everyone else, even from behind bars. Broader societal impact, the crime that captivated the public. Ethan had seen it happen before, true crime stories that took over the news cycle, turning real-life tragedies into entertainment, but he had never imagined being the center of one. The case sparked endless debates. Some saw Claire as a cold-blooded manipulator, a symbol of deception and betrayal. Others painted her as something else entirely, a woman trapped in a bad marriage who sought freedom in the only way she knew how. Some people actually admired her. Ethan had come across online forums where users dissected every detail of the case, some calling Claire brilliant, others labeling her pure evil. There were conspiracy theories too, people who believed she had been framed, that Ethan had somehow twisted the narrative in his favor. And then there were the books, the podcasts, the documentaries, strangers dissecting his life, analyzing every detail as if they knew him, as if they had been there in that room, watching as his world collapsed. It made him wonder, when did crime stop being about the victims? When did people start romanticizing monsters? Themes of power, morality, and deception. What haunted Ethan the most wasn't just the crime itself, but the realization of how fragile trust really was. Love, marriage, partnership, these things were supposed to be built on mutual respect, on understanding, on honesty. But Claire had shown him that even the deepest bonds could be faked, that someone could smile at you, kiss you goodnight, and still be planning your downfall behind your back. He had given her everything, his love, his trust, his home, and she had turned it into a crime scene. It made him question everything. How many other people lived like he once had, blissfully unaware that the person they shared their life with was capable of something horrifying? How many others had ignored the signs, dismissing them as paranoia, as overthinking? And if Claire had succeeded, if Ethan hadn't walked in that night, would anyone have ever known the truth? Power, Ethan realized, wasn't always about control in the obvious ways. It wasn't just about physical dominance or authority. It was about perception. Claire had power because she knew how to manipulate reality. She understood people, how to make them believe what she wanted, how to twist narratives in her favor. And that was the most terrifying part of all. Moving forward, learning to live again. Ethan was still rebuilding. He didn't trust easily anymore. Not friends, not strangers, not even himself. Every interaction felt loaded, every smile a potential lie. He questioned people's motives, their words, their actions, but he was trying. Therapy helped, though it didn't erase the scars. The nightmares still came, but they weren't as frequent. The memories still lingered, but they didn't paralyze him like they used to. He had started writing again. Not about Claire, not about what happened, but about things that made sense. Small, ordinary moments. The way the coffee shop on the corner smelled like cinnamon in the mornings. The sound of rain against his window. The feeling of stepping into the sun after weeks of cold. The little things that reminded him he was still here. Still alive. Still moving forward. Claire would never leave his mind completely. She would always be there, lurking in the shadows of his past, a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. But she wouldn't define him. She had taken enough already, and Ethan refused to give her anything more.